I am Eleanor Vance, and for 28 years, I lived a life defined by accommodation. People looked at Richard and me and saw the perfect picture of middle-aged success. They saw the beautiful suburban home, the expensive cars, and our brilliant daughter, Sophie, preparing to graduate from a top university. What they didn't see was the meticulous foundation of effort I had constructed beneath Richard's endless facade of ambition. Before marrying Richard, I had a promising career path in financial risk analysis. I understood complex assets, fiduciary duties, and, crucially, how to track money that didn't want to be found. But when Sophie was born, Richard, ever the silver-tongued visionary, persuaded me to put my career on hold. He needed unfettered space to launch his multiple, perpetually failing ventures. And I agreed. I traded the boardroom for the budget spreadsheet, the analyst reports for managing Richard's disastrous investment portfolio, and the six-figure salary for a quiet understanding that I was the financial backbone of our family, even if he was the public face. My generosity was boundless, and Richard's sense of entitlement was absolute. "Eleanor, darling, the capital injection for the artisanal coffee bean roastery isn't discretionary spending, it's an investment in our future," he'd declare, stirring his third cup of expensive Java, paid for by the dividends of the few safe stocks I had managed to salvage from his previous tech startup implosion. I wasn't blind. Richard never held a job for long. He had the charisma of a CEO but the work ethic of an intern on a permanent coffee break. Yet, I protected him. I managed the mortgage, paid the private school tuition, and funded every single one of his big ideas, telling myself that true partnership meant carrying the heavier load when needed. For 28 years, Richard never once questioned the cost of the life he enjoyed, because he never paid it. We were nearing Sophie's college graduation, the milestone I had worked toward my entire adult life. It was a moment of immense pride, but Richard treated it like another opportunity for self-aggrandizement. "I've finalized the plans for the graduation party," he informed me one evening, tapping away on his brand-new phone, a device I had reluctantly upgraded for him after he'd accidentally dropped his last one in a hotel hot tub during a supposed business trip. "Wonderful, Richard. Did you stick to the budget I laid out?" I asked mildly, sipping my tea. He waved a dismissive hand. "The budget was far too pedestrian, Eleanor. This is a celebration of our achievement. I took the liberty of doubling the catering order and securing that ridiculously overpriced vintage champagne. We need to look successful." I sighed inwardly. "We are successful, Richard. But we don't need to mortgage the house to prove it." "Oh, always so practical," he scoffed, his face twisting into that familiar mask of weary condescension he reserved only for me. "It's why I handle the vision and you handle the tedious calculations. Relax, I put everything on the platinum card." That comment, the mention of the platinum card, was the pinprick of ice that shattered my complacency. Richard had a shared business card for his current consulting firm that I was supposed to monitor weekly. Over the past few months, his travel expenses had become strangely erratic. Large sums were appearing for luxury boutique hotels in cities where his clients certainly did not reside, and the receipts were always blurry, missing itemizations, or suspiciously delayed. I told myself it was sloppy accounting. I told myself he was stressed. But the phrase "dropped the phone in a hotel hot tub" looped in my mind, synchronizing disturbingly with the recent charge on the platinum card, a massive, undocumented wire transfer labeled vaguely as operational logistics, which bypassed my standard approval protocols. The analytical part of my brain, the part one had carefully suppressed for decades, in favor of being the supportive wife, reared up. This wasn't sloppy. This was intentional obfuscation. Late that night, after Richard was snoring soundly, exhausted from a long day of visioneering, I sat down at my personal home terminal, the one Richard didn't know existed, protected by corporate-level encryption. I didn't bother using his login information, I just used my professional access to the back-end financial portals, tracing the platinum card's activity history and the destination of the suspicious wire transfer. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the old muscle memory of a forensic accountant resurfacing instantly. I bypassed layers of shell companies Richard had incompetently set up and followed the money trail directly to its end point. The wire transfer wasn't for operational logistics. It was a substantial down payment on an apartment in Miami. And the phone number associated with the lease wasn't Richard's. My heart didn't break, it turned to granite. It was worse than an affair. It was calculated, financial fraud perpetrated against me, the person who had secured his entire existence. I cross-referenced the Miami address with the travel dates from the boutique hotels. Then, using my access to public records databases, the same tools I used years ago to expose corporate malfeasance, I pulled up the name associated with the new lease, along with her social media profile. Her name was Michelle. She was 27. And the most recent photo on her feed, taken 2 weeks prior, showed her standing on a balcony overlooking the ocean, laughing joyously, wearing the very expensive gold locket I had given Richard for his birthday 5 years ago. The betrayal was complete. Richard wasn't just having an affair, he was systematically dismantling the financial life I had built, preparing to abandon me using my own funds, while planning a glamorous new life in Miami with a woman young enough to be his daughter. The sound that left my throat was not a sob. It was a cold, sharp breath of clarity. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. And Richard, the entitled fool, had just handed the sharpest financial mind he knew all the evidence she needed. The instant the cold clarity settled, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I would not explode. I would not shout. I would not even show the slightest tremor of distress. Richard thrived on drama and victimhood. Confronting him now would only give him time to scramble, hire lawyers, and start hiding the considerable assets I had worked decades to accumulate. Instead, I became the gray rock. For the next 8 weeks, I perfected the art of bland, predictable compliance. Richard needed to believe his supportive, financially tedious wife was exactly where he left her, waiting for him to bestow attention upon her. I smiled when he talked about his visionary strategies. I nodded when he complained about the inconvenience of his latest business trip, a trip that now included a meticulous paper trail of boutique hotel stays, plane tickets purchased on the corporate card, and gifts charged to accounts he assumed I didn't track. I even helped him pick out a truly expensive, completely unnecessary watch he decided he needed for Sophie's graduation ceremony. "You're wonderful, Eleanor," he'd say, kissing me absent-mindedly on the forehead before heading off to his supposed office, smelling faintly of a new, offensively modern cologne. "It's so comforting to know I don't have to worry about the home front. You make everything run so smoothly." You have no idea how smoothly, I thought, meticulously downloading the encrypted data logs of his calendar entries. While Richard was busy crafting his grand exit narrative, I was engaged in a full-scale financial and legal audit, performed with the ruthless precision of a military operation. The first piece of the puzzle was the prenuptial agreement. Richard had signed it 28 years ago, mostly to appease my hyper-cautious father, a retired CPA. Richard hadn't actually read the document. He had skimmed a clause about asset division and declared it boring boilerplate. What he missed, and what I had ensured was legally ironclad, was the fidelity and fiduciary duty clause. When I traded the boardroom for motherhood, I hadn't lost my professional vigilance. The clause stipulated that if either party committed adultery and was found to have systematically depleted or misallocated joint marital assets for the purpose of maintaining the infidelity, the injured party would receive 85% of the marital estate, along with control of all business entities and properties. Crucially, it defined misallocation as any non-business related wire transfer exceeding $10,000 without written spousal consent. Richard's recent $50,000 down payment on the Miami apartment with Michelle, labeled as operational logistics, was not just misallocation, it was irrefutable, contractual breach of fiduciary duty. My home terminal, the one Richard dismissed as Eleanor's boring accounting station, became my war room. I worked through the nights, sometimes running complex models while Richard snored just 2 walls away. I focused on 3 critical areas. 1. Digital evidence capture. I mirrored every device Richard owned, his new phone, his office laptop, his cloud storage, archiving every text message with Michelle, every romantic email planning their future, and every receipt from extravagant purchases made in her name. The discovery that he had been using our savings to buy Michelle designer handbags while simultaneously telling me we needed to cut back on house maintenance only sharpened the granite of my resolve. 2. Asset securitization. I couldn't just drain the accounts, that would be visible and reactive. Instead, I quietly restructured his liquid investments. I transferred Richard's remaining stake in his consulting firm, which was essentially a phantom entity operating at a net loss, into irrevocable trust structures, naming Sophie as the sole beneficiary, effective upon my designation as executor. I increased the mortgage escrow and converted our remaining joint cash reserves into safer, low-yield municipal bonds, making the funds difficult to liquidate quickly without incurring massive penalties Richard would soon be facing. 3. Legal coordination. I engaged Martha Albright, the sharpest divorce attorney in the state, known for her ability to handle high-net-worth separation cases with cold discretion. I didn't schedule a face-to-face meeting until all the evidence was digitized and indexed. We communicated exclusively through secured channels and code phrases. The inventory is complete, I told Martha one afternoon, using the phrase we designated to signal the end of the evidence-gathering phase. And the vessel is prepared, she asked, referring to the formal serving of the divorce papers. The papers are signed, notarized, and sealed. We will serve them precisely at 8 a.m. on graduation day, I confirmed. Richard, meanwhile, was oblivious, soaring on his manufactured confidence. He was consumed by his own spectacular narrative. He spent hours practicing his graduation speech, a monologue he insisted on giving, claiming Sophie's success was proof of his unwavering vision. I think I'll make a toast, Eleanor. A grand statement about starting the next chapter of my life, he mused, swirling an expensive glass of scotch. That sounds ambitious, Richard, I replied, managing the perfect shade of bland neutrality. The timing was crucial. Richard had scheduled his dramatic public announcement for the commencement ceremony luncheon, a moment of maximum emotional leverage and public visibility. He wanted to look like the courageous man finally breaking free. But he needed to be financially gutted and legally bound before he could step onto that stage. I looked at the calendar, Friday. Graduation was Saturday. The trap was set. Richard had enjoyed the illusion of control for 28 years, entirely unaware that the supportive wife he patronized was not only the architect of his financial success but also the meticulously prepared demolition expert. His new life in Miami was about to become a very expensive, very short-lived footnote. The final 24 hours were a masterclass in emotional invisibility. I moved through the suburban home that Friday, arranging luggage for the short trip to the university, packing Richard's tuxedo, and ensuring the car was full of gas. I was a perfectly functioning automaton, executing the final steps of a deeply complex operation. Richard, meanwhile, was vibrating with self-importance. He viewed this weekend not as his daughter's momentous academic achievement, but as his own triumphant farewell performance. Eleanor, darling, did you remember to iron the silk scarf? I need to look exceptionally sharp for the cameras, he requested, sweeping into the living room where I was reviewing the encrypted file checklist one last time. It's pressed and hanging in your garment bag, I confirmed, keeping my voice flat. He poured himself an expensive scotch, a bottle I knew we couldn't technically afford, but which he claimed was necessary for pre-celebration relaxation, and stood by the window, practicing his monologue. And as I look out today, I see not an ending, but a glorious new horizon, he intoned, gesturing dramatically toward the perfectly manicured lawn. It's about vision, Eleanor. That's what I'm trying to convey. The courage to seize the next chapter. The audience will appreciate the sincerity, I murmured, noting the dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't relaxed, he was anxious to escape, to trade his predictable life for the manufactured glamour of Miami and Michelle. He laughed, a short, patronizing sound. Oh, you wouldn't understand, Eleanor. You're happy with the same old script. Some of us are built for more dynamic narratives. I feel like a man reborn. Truly free. I'm sure you do, I replied. I closed the laptop, secured the external hard drive containing decades of evidence, and placed it inside my briefcase, locking it with a key I wore around my neck. "Enjoy your scotch, Richard. I'm turning in early. Tomorrow is a long day." He barely noticed my departure. He was too busy rehearsing his freedom. I didn't sleep. I lay awake, tracing the blueprint of my plan. I had lived 28 years according to Richard's expectations. In less than 12 hours, I would be executing my own, meticulously calculated vision. At 6:30 a.m. on Saturday, the day Sophie was to graduate, I was fully dressed and downstairs. Richard was still asleep, enjoying the last precious minutes of his ignorance. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, for me, and waited for the chime. At 7:55 a.m., the security system signaled a perimeter breach. I disabled the alarm before it could wake Richard. I opened the front door to find Martha Albright's lead paralegal, a stern, efficient young man named Ben, standing beside a courier. "Eleanor Vance?" Ben asked formally. "Yes. Richard is upstairs. Please be silent and quick." The plan was surgical. Richard needed to be served the papers personally, signed by 2 witnesses, and the serving had to be documented by the courier before 8:30 a.m., ensuring that the legal proceedings were officially underway before Richard left for the commencement ceremony. I led Ben and the courier up the stairs to the master bedroom. Richard was sprawled across the king-sized bed, clutching the new, expensive watch he intended to wear. I gave Ben the slightest nod. Ben cleared his throat, loud enough to pierce Richard's sleep. Richard jolted upright, squinting against the morning light, his expression quickly morphing from startled confusion to irritation. "Eleanor. What in God's name? Who are these people?" he demanded, clutching the duvet to his chest. Ben stepped forward, holding a thick, manila envelope sealed with a vibrant red wax stamp. "Richard Vance?" Ben said, his voice clipped and professional. "You have been served. This envelope contains a petition for dissolution of marriage, a writ of fiduciary fraud, and supporting evidence, filed this morning, 8 a.m., in the district court." Richard stared at the envelope. He blinked, attempting to process the formality, his brain still fuzzy with sleep and scotch fumes. "Served? What is this, Eleanor? A prank?" He looked at me, expecting me to intervene, to apologize for the intrusion. I didn't move. I watched him with a detached curiosity, as if he were a particularly difficult accounting problem I had finally solved. "Richard," I said, my voice quiet, clear, and perfectly steady. "Open the envelope." Sensing that this was not a joke, Richard snatched the packet. He ripped the seal and the contents spilled onto the bed. His eyes darted across the pages, searching for the familiar legal language, but landing instead on the horrifying summary sheet prepared by Martha. The summary clearly detailed the fidelity and fiduciary duty clause from the prenuptial agreement he never read. It cited the documented evidence, the texts, the calendar entries, and the specific, damning details of the $50,000 wire transfer for the Miami apartment, the payment he had fraudulently labeled operational logistics. 85%? What is this nonsense? "Eleanor, you can't be serious. We have a standard prenuptial," his voice cracked. He found the section defining the financial breach and the corresponding penalty. Then, he saw the final piece of documentation, a detailed accounting, prepared by me, showing that all liquid assets he planned to seize had been converted, securitized, or funneled into trusts, leaving him with an immediate cash deficit and an outstanding tax liability from his phantom consulting firm. The new life he planned was financially extinct. The color drained from Richard's face, replacing his arrogance with a sickening shade of white. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "The funds for the apartment, Richard," I explained calmly, adjusting the cuff of my blazer. "That wasn't just adultery. It was embezzlement under the terms of our contract. You broke fiduciary duty. You signed the agreement 28 years ago, and now, the contract has been executed." The courier finished signing his form. Ben placed a final copy of the filing on the nightstand. We are required to wait for confirmation that the documents have been received and understood, Ben stated, looking at Richard. Richard dropped the papers. Understood? I built this life. I created this wealth. You were just my support staff. You created the debts, Richard. I managed the wealth, I corrected. And you had your chance to be honest and financially prudent. You chose Michelle and Miami. Now you choose the consequences. I turned to leave the room, pausing only at the door. By the way, Richard, I added, delivering the final, quiet blow. I've already cancelled the ridiculous catering order and the vintage champagne. I won't allow you to spend the assets I worked to protect on a party designed for your vanity. If you plan on attending Sophie's graduation, you have 1 hour to compose yourself and arrive on time. You will be polite. You will be supportive. And you will not mention the next chapter of your life. Because that chapter has already been written, by me. I left him there, sitting in the ruins of his carefully constructed illusion. The trap was sprung. The professional analyst in me felt a surge of satisfaction. The wife was gone. Eleanor Vance, the financial expert, was in control. It was time to go watch our daughter graduate. The drive to the university campus was unnervingly peaceful. Richard, surprisingly, had managed to dress himself, but the expensive tuxedo hung on him like a shroud. He sat in the passenger seat, rigid and silent, occasionally shaking his head slightly, as if attempting to dislodge a bad dream. He looked small, stripped of his grandiosity. I had dressed impeccably, a sharp navy suit, sensible heels, and the only piece of jewelry Richard ever gave me that meant anything, a simple, elegant watch. I was driving. Richard didn't even attempt to reach for the keys, his hands were still trembling from the shock of the morning. We found Sophie easily. She ran toward us, radiating joy in her cap and gown. Mom. Dad. You made it. Isn't this amazing? Richard managed a strained smile, pulling her into a brief, awkward hug. His eyes darted around the crowded courtyard, looking for observers, trying to gauge if his morning terror was visible on his face. The commencement ceremony itself was torture for him. He sat ramrod straight, constantly touching the silk tie he had insisted I iron, desperately clinging to the illusion of control. Every flowery speech about integrity, hard work, and responsible citizenship seemed to land on him like a physical blow. I didn't speak to him. I simply watched Sophie, memorizing the proud angle of her chin, the sparkle in her eyes. This moment belonged to her, and I would not allow Richard's petulant breakdown to diminish it. After the formalities, the celebratory luncheon was held in a glass-walled reception hall overlooking the green. Richard knew this was his last stand, the stage where he planned to execute his triumphant exit. His face was a mixture of residual panic and resurfacing desperation. He kept reaching for his new phone, but I had already remotely deactivated his business line and restricted his personal cell to emergency calls only, pending legal review. As the catering staff began clearing the main course, Richard tapped his champagne glass, the cheap stuff I had purchased after canceling his vintage order. The room quieted. To Sophie, he declared, his voice a little too loud, a little too manic. To our brilliant daughter, whose success proves that true visionaries can indeed shape the world. He then pivoted, aiming the intensity of his gaze not at Sophie, but at the assembled guests, family friends, colleagues, and potential future investors he planned to fleece later. But today, he continued, taking a deep, shuddering breath, ready to launch his next chapter monologue. I want to talk about the courage required to pursue a glorious new horizon. Sometimes, you have to break free from the constraints of the past to embrace a dynamic future. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes were no longer focused on the crowd, but on me. He realized, too late, that he was talking about breaking free from the constraints of the past, while sitting directly across from the woman who held the legal and financial hammer poised above his head. I raised my hand, the movement subtle but commanding, drawing the attention of the table. Richard is correct, I stated, my voice clear and measured, slicing through the tension. This weekend truly marks the beginning of a new chapter. For all of us. Richard began to sputter. Eleanor, darling, perhaps we can discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss, Richard. The contract is executed, I said, delivering the legal phrase with the same indifference I would use to discuss a quarterly earnings report. I leaned forward, addressing the table with the precise sincerity of a corporate spokesperson. I want to thank everyone here for celebrating Sophie today. And since Richard has chosen this public forum to discuss New Horizons, I feel it's appropriate to share some professional news of my own. I paused, letting the weight of the silence settle. Richard's hands were gripping the edges of the table, his knuckles white. As many of you know, Richard and I have maintained a lengthy business partnership for 28 years. However, this morning, that partnership was officially dissolved due to a significant breach of fiduciary duty and financial malfeasance on Richard's part. A collective gasp swept the nearest tables. Richard finally found his voice, a pathetic hiss. Eleanor. You will ruin me. I am simply confirming the current account status, I corrected, maintaining eye contact. The specifics of the dissolution, governed by our standing prenuptial agreement, result in my immediate acquisition of 85% of the marital estate and full control over all existing properties and business entities. This restructuring became necessary after I discovered Richard's attempt to systematically misallocate over $50,000 of joint assets, deceptively labeled as operational logistics, toward personal and extramarital expenses. I paused one last time, allowing the word extramarital to hang in the air, connecting Richard's lofty talk of New Horizons directly to his tawdry, expensive deceit. The phone Richard had been clutching finally vibrated, a text message. He fumbled to open it. The look that spread across his face was the culmination of his ruin. It was worse than panic, it was absolute devastation. I knew exactly who it was from, Michelle. While Richard had been rehearsing his grandiose speech, I had ensured his last available joint bank account, the one he was relying on for his post-graduation escape, was legally frozen. I had also sent a final, professional email to Michelle, attaching the court filing that showed Richard was financially decimated and citing the specific clause regarding the $50,000 apartment down payment. Richard looked up, his voice barely a croak. Michelle, she just sent me the bank notification. And a letter. She's gone. She's demanding the return of the funds. Yes, Richard, I confirmed softly. I alerted her to the fact that her new life in Miami was funded by embezzled assets, making her complicit in the fraud. Michelle didn't want a visionary, she wanted a bank account. And I closed the account. The room had fallen completely silent. Richard was not a free man seeking a new horizon, he was a financially bankrupt, publicly humiliated man abandoned by his mistress on the very day he thought he'd finally escape. You didn't just divorce me, Eleanor, Richard whispered, the arrogance utterly extinguished. You ended me. No, Richard, I said, meeting his gaze with the steady, clear eyes of the professional I had been before him. I simply reconciled the accounts. And for the first time in 28 years, the balance sheet is accurate. I stood up, walked around the table, and placed a calm kiss on Sophie's cheek. Congratulations, darling. You earned this. Then, leaving Richard Vance, the empty shell of a visionary, alone among the staring guests, I walked out into the sunlight. The future was mine, and the view was glorious. 2 years. 2 years since I served Richard his papers alongside his morning coffee, 2 years since I reconciled the accounts, and 2 years since I finally acknowledged the true cost of accommodation. The irony is, Richard did get his glorious new horizon, but it was exactly as threadbare and pitiful as his integrity. The dissolution of the marriage was swift and brutal, for him. The fidelity clause was airtight. Richard fought the prenuptial agreement with every incompetent lawyer he could hire, but my forensic documentation was indisputable. The texts, the emails, and the clear paper trail of the $50,000 misallocated for the Miami apartment proved the breach of fiduciary duty beyond any doubt. The court sided entirely with the evidence. Richard was left with 15% of the assets, which primarily consisted of the non-transferable, depreciating remains of his failed consulting ventures and a massive tax liability I had expertly shielded myself from. He lost the house, the cars, and what little reputation he possessed. I hear whispers about him occasionally. He's renting a cramped apartment above a dry cleaner and, predictably, is trying to launch yet another visionary business, this one involving sustainable, organic dog treats. It's struggling. Without my meticulous management, without my capacity to cover his debts, and without my name lending him credibility, he is exactly what he always was, a charisma-driven man with zero operational skills. Sophie, who saw the devastation of graduation day and quickly read the detailed financial report I provided, keeps her communication with him polite but distant. Richard Vance, the perpetual victim, occasionally tries to call, looking for a handout. I have his calls forwarded directly to Martha Albright's firm. My life, however, is not just recovered, it is magnificent. I sold the sprawling suburban mansion, the monument to Richard's insecurity, and purchased a loft apartment downtown, all glass and steel, overlooking the bustling financial district. More importantly, I launched Echelon Financial Risk. Echelon is not just an accounting firm, it is a specialized financial consultancy designed exclusively for women undergoing major life transitions, divorce, widowhood, or career changes. We handle asset protection, fiduciary audits, and, perhaps most importantly, we demystify the complex financial systems that men like Richard use to keep their wives reliant and ignorant. I sit in my new office, the sun streaming in, and I feel the true weight of financial power. I finally wear the title I earned long ago, financial analyst and CEO. My clients are successful, sharp women who recognize that Richard's public humiliation proved one crucial fact: I am ruthless when protecting capital, and I leave no stone unturned. My freedom is absolute. I travel when I want, invest where I choose, and answer only to myself. The fear that had kept me tethered to Richard, the fear of financial collapse, is gone. I realized that my financial security was never contingent on him, it was only ever contingent on my own suppressed brilliance. For 28 years, I played the role of the supportive wife, the quiet architect behind the man who thought he held the reins. Richard used my expertise as his safety net, never realizing that the same careful hand that constructed his wealth was perfectly capable of dismantling it. The old Eleanor Vance, the one defined by accommodation, is a distant memory. The woman who remains is Eleanor Vance, the expert. And the balance sheet, finally, reflects the truth. My investment in myself yielded the highest return of all.